to Anatomy and Physiology on Demand. This is week 12, lecture A, and this is the fourth and final part of this lecture where we are finishing everything for the central nervous system. So let's get started. And now we're going to talk about the spinal cord. So two different pictures here. On the picture on the left, this is a transverse section of the spinal cord, where you clearly can see the H-shaped gray matter or butterfly shape, whichever word you want to use. And the picture on the right, pause it for a second and try to figure out if you think this is a view of the spinal cord from the anterior aspect or the posterior aspect. Okay, so hopefully by now you have recognized all the little gyri of the cerebellum. So we are looking at the posterior aspect of the spinal cord here. And so these are going to be posterior little roots. You can see the posterior root ganglion. And this white thing going all the way down, that is going to be your dura mater all the way down. So when we look at the spinal cord, it is not a tube that is the same diameter the entire length of it. In the neck area, there is an enlargement known as the cervical enlargement. And in the upper lumbar, lower thoracic area, there is what is called the lumbar enlargement. And the reason why it's wider here is because we have more gray matter due to all the innervation coming from and going to the upper extremities in the cervical enlargement and the lower extremities in the lumbar enlargement. The second thing I want you to realize is where the spinal cord actually ends. When the spinal cord was first formed, it went the entire length of your spine. Then what happened was your spine got longer, but your spinal cord did not lengthen nearly as much. So the spinal cord does not go all the way down to the sacrum anymore. Now it ends at the L1, L2 level. So as the spine grows, the inferior end of the spinal cord does not stay with that vertebrae that it started with. However, it's not just floating in space there. There is a connection which is anchoring it down, which we will learn about shortly. So most people, when you talk to them about the spinal cord, they're thinking, oh, someone needs a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture. Okay? And so the way this happens is because we know it ends at the L1, L2, we will go down at the L3 area, and we are putting a needle between the vertebrae, okay, and into that subarachnoid space, because that's where the cerebral spinal fluid is. And so when the needle is going in, you can feel it going through the actual intervertebral disc. And then as you're working your way, all of a sudden you'll be hitting the really tough dura mater, and you can feel it pop when you get to the dura mater. Okay. And then if you take off the other end of the needle, the cerebral spinal fluid just drips out on its own. You don't pull it back with a syringe like that picture is showing. You don't have to do it like that. Now, that is different than the epidurals, which are given for anesthesia for some operations or for childbirth, because an epidural means you want to be superficial to the dura. So basically the needle is going at the same locations through the intervertebral disc, but we do not want to have that pop going through the dura. We want the anesthetic to stay out here, so it will be hitting the sensory roots as they're going into the spinal cord. So looking at the anatomy of the spinal cord, the gray matter consists of horns. We have a posterior or dorsal horn. Usually we use the word dorsal. We have a ventral horn. And then in the thoracic area, we have a lateral horn, which is going to be related to cell bodies of neurons for part of our autonomic nervous system. And that's why it's not in the lumbar area. The white matter are called columns, and so we're going to have a dorsal column, a ventral column, and then between the two horns laterally we will have a lateral column. So outside the spinal cord, we have the peripheral nervous system. And as you recall, the peripheral nervous system is going to have sensory neurons bringing afferent messages, and most of the motor neurons carrying the efferent messages. So the sensory neuron, its cell body is located in the dorsal root ganglion. And as you can see, this is a pseudo-unipolar neuron. So the afferent sensory information is coming from wherever the receptor is, carries it to the dorsal root ganglion, and then the axon exits the dorsal root ganglion, goes through the dorsal root, and will synapse then in the dorsal horn. And then from there, the axons that want to take the message upward will take the messages up in the columns, not in the horn. And when motor message is coming down, eventually we will have an interneuron which will go to the ventral horn, and from there we will have a neuron whose cell body is in the ventral horn, and then the axon exits through the ventral root and eventually will make its way to where it needs to go for the motor response. And as I mentioned before, in the lateral horn, that's where we would find our cell bodies for the autonomic nervous system, specifically sympathetic nervous system that we're going to talk about later when we talk about peripheral nervous system. Okay. So those tracts, remember what a tract is. Those tracts are going to ascend and descend in the columns, sorry. Okay. Remembering when they get up to the medulla oblongata, and they're going to desiccate, they are going to cross sides. So this picture is showing the location of the sensory and the motor tracts. If you recall, the sensory afferent information comes in through the dorsal root ganglion. So it makes sense then that the tracts that are carrying sensory information will be in the dorsal columns as well as in the lateral column. And then the motor information that's coming down will go to both of the ventral horns. And so those axons are going to be carried in the lateral columns and the ventral columns. Okay. So dorsal root ganglion is where the sensory neuron cell body is, and the sensory axons are going to be going on the dorsal column and the lateral column. The lateral column and the ventral column will have the axons for the motor neurons because they are going to be exiting in the ventral root. Okay. So hopefully that all makes sense. Let's look at the inferior end of the spinal cord for a moment. And if you look at the end of the spinal cord, it tapers into a little cone head, a little pointy thing called the conus medullaris. Okay? And then there are a couple other structures associated with the conus medullaris. The first one comes right from the middle of the conus medullaris, and it's a piece of pia mater which goes all the way down towards the coccyx and anchors it. So remember, the spinal cord used to go around to the second sacral vertebrae when you were in utero, and it still was anchored to the coccyx. And then as it got shorter, that pia mater anchor just lengthened. So the anchor just got longer. Okay. And that anchor is the filum terminale, which just means the terminal. I don't know what filum means, but it's the last part of it. Okay. And the last part that is in this area has to do with, if you look on the sides of the filum terminale, what you are going to see are a whole bunch of roots of the spinal nerves. So they are going to come out, and then some will pass here, some will pass at the next level, some will pass at the next level, some will pass at the next level. Remember, in the sacrum, we still have 3 intervertebral foramina when they need to pass, and then our lowest ones will pass between the sacrum and the coccyx. So we have all these roots that need to go out. And so all those roots together, this is what they look like in a fresh human or fresh dissection of a human spinal cord. And if you would let this sit, what happens is these darken and they look exactly like the very thick, coarse hairs that you find on a horse's tail. So if you know what a horse's tail looks like, then you know what this looks like. And that's why it's called the cauda equina. Equine is a horse, so the horse's tail is exactly what it looks like. Okay, so that's it for the spinal cord. And the last part I want to talk about is so that you understand memory. So hopefully it will help you with your studying in this class and other ones. The first thing I want you to realize is environment can change your brain structure. Okay, so yes, you can teach an old dog new tricks. Yes, you can teach your grandma how to Skype, how to Zoom, how to FaceTime, all that kind of stuff. And what we have found is we need to continue stimulating our brains as we get older, and we actually can increase the number of synapses by doing this, and the neurons themselves get larger and they start branching at all those nodes of Ranvier. So the more you study, the easier it becomes to study, if that kind of makes sense. That's how to make it relative to you. So when we look at memory, we have a lot of different kinds of memory. And basically, I want to spend most of the time just talking about these top three so that you understand them, because all these other ones, they all have to do with long-term memory. So the first type of memory we're going to talk about is sensory memory. And this is what we do for immediate tasks that last a second or two. You'll look at a recipe, it'll say half a cup of chopped onions, you get your onion and you'll start chopping it. So it can be highly detailed, it can be visual, it can be auditory, it can be any kind of thing. And basically you use it and you forget it. Okay, so everything here is involving the frontal cortex, and you will not have any recollection of any of these things because literally it's for tasks that are only lasting a couple of seconds. So there is an unlimited amount of this that your brain can do throughout your entire life. The second type of memory lasts a little bit longer, and that's called short-term memory. Unfortunately, this is the type of memory a lot of students rely on for taking quizzes and tests, and that's why they are bad test takers, because they haven't moved the information into long-term memory. So the way short-term memory works is that you can learn about 2 seconds worth, which is usually around 7 items. Okay, so the classic example of short-term memory is somebody's phone number, where you go 641-7061. And you can repeat it to yourself over and over and over and over and over again until you finally have it typed into your phone or you have phoned somebody. Okay. And that's all there is to it. If you are speaking a language, for instance, where numbers are shorter and they're not, they don't have as much time or as many syllables as we do here in the United States, then you could have more digits that you could learn. Like a lot of the Asian numbers, you could probably handle 10 as opposed to our 7. Now, short-term memory, we tend to do a lot of short-term memory, but what I want you to realize is sound memories last longer. And this is part of the reason, especially with my labs, I'm always saying, say the words out loud, because that will create a longer memory. And you can keep on working this until you use it. So the whole time you are writing and doing the exercise, say the important words out loud. Keep on saying them again and again and again. Okay. So the whole point of short-term memory is to put it to immediate use, not to store it for later. To store it for later, we have to make it into long-term memory. And so basically with short-term memory, we use it, we lose it, or we figure out how to make it into long-term memory. And this one type is very susceptible to GABA and glutamate and neurotransmitters and trauma and meds and lack of oxygen. Okay, so this is why, for instance, people with Alzheimer's, they have a real problem with short-term memory. They cannot tell you what they ate 10 minutes ago, but they can tell you what they ate at their wedding 50 years ago, because they have no problem with the long-term memory that was already made before their Alzheimer's came into play. So with that, let's move on to long-term memory with this studious guy over there. So a lot of this is going to involve the limbic area, but the limbic area does not store memory. It organizes or unifies it. And so it's going to take parts of that sensor in short-term memory, and it's going to figure out how to make it into long-term memory. And so here are the clues for how to make long-term memory. The first thing you have to do is consolidate the information. Okay? And that doesn't have to do with the amount of time you're spending on it. That has to do with, you have to organize it so it follows logically, whether you're going to make an outline or whatever. You can't just randomly learn these facts so that you have like, oh, I've memorized these things, because you'll never remember. You haven't related them to anything. You have to make it meaningful to you. And here's the best way to do it. Chunk it. Find something you know. That's your starting point. Then build something onto that. So this is like making a concept map. We know this, and then we're going to build this concept onto that. And this concept also goes to that. Now this concept goes to here, but not to there. And so we can make all these little connections. And by doing this chunking or these concept maps, that allows your brain to group these items, which really facilitates your learning. So if you're the type of person that just likes to make this long list and memorize it, that's not great, because it's here today, gone tomorrow. Literally, you're relying on short-term memory memorization as opposed to true understanding, which is what we want for long-term memory. And here's the great news. There's no capacity limit for long-term memory. Okay? And the more you review it, the more synapses you're going to get, and the more resistant it is to you forgetting it or resistant to injury. Remember, like, it may have been 20 years since you rode a bike, and you'll still know how to ride a bike. Okay, so stabilize it by repeating it, or make associations with prior memories, or make emotions, because that increases synapses. Or what, in addition, if you're working on long-term memory, don't only teach it to yourself, then try to teach it to somebody else. Practicing the transfer of learning actually speeds how fast you learn. So this is why I've been promoting, find your study group, work with your study group. Everybody's grades go up if you study in a smaller group. And I know you're long distance now, but figure out how to FaceTime with your friends from before and get those study groups going again. The other thing I want to tell you is that long-term memory definitely affects your perceptions of the world. Like, for instance, your perception of this class is, oh, this is really high powered, this is science, he's got a studious little guy over there. But somebody who wasn't coming in thinking this is an anatomy physiology class, this is very serious, would come in, they would see that picture, and they would clearly see the word liar there, and they'd go, what's that about? But that's not what you were expecting, so you didn't see that. Okay, so talking about aspects of long-term memory. Okay, declarative, that's the stuff that you know. Okay, well, actually, let me start here in the middle, obviously, since that came up for procedures, the riding the bike, the skills you use unconsciously. If you are a master at free throw shots when you are 20, you will be better at 40 than somebody who never learned how to do free throw shots. You won't be as good as you were at 20, but you'll be a lot better than somebody else. If you have spent 10 years learning how to play the piano, and then you don't play the piano at all because you're busy raising a family and working, and then when your kids move out from college, you can go back and you're not starting at ground zero. Okay, so those are procedural knowledge. The next type are the declarative facts. Okay, what are the odd numbers? What are the even numbers? What are the consonants? What are the vowels? You have a lot of this in your brain already. You want to get a lot of your anatomy to become this for when you get to your upper division classes. And the third types are the episodes. And some of these you will remember because you're old enough, you can remember your high school graduation. Other things you don't remember, but you've heard the stories enough times that you think you remember. Okay, so how does that work? The retrieval of memory. We actually then are going to be involving multiple parts of our cortex. If it's visual, we'll draw in the occipital lobe. It was auditory, we'll draw in the temporal lobe. And basically, we're going to bring our limbic system in here as well as the cortex, and we're going to try to put them all together. And that will give us a memory. Now, here's the kicker. If you are rewarded for something, we can put unrelated things together and think they all happened at the same time, because maybe you remember this one episode when your brother did something, and then you remember something else when he was mean to you at bedtime, whatever, and then you remember you were really, really sick and he wouldn't help you. And now you think all three happened at the same time. Okay. If it fulfills the expectation, my brother was mean to me my entire childhood, then you are creating that memory which really didn't exist. Or if you're rewarded for that memory, then it's the same thing. Those are false memories. So now you know how to make your long-term memories, but I want to talk one more thing about it, and that is the importance of sleep. So at this point, raise your hand if you've ever pulled an all-nighter. I don't want to see who's raising their hands because I know some of my kids have too, until I've had multiple talks with them about sleep and memory. Two huge reasons why I tell you, go to bed, okay? While you are sleeping, the first thing that is happening is all those waste products which have been building up all day in your neurons are being washed out into your cerebral spinal fluid. Power, number one. So those neurons are ready to work again the next day. The second thing is the quick memories which were made in your limbic system are now being transferred to your frontal cortex memory system so they can be long-term. What you will find out, and if you say, oh, but Dr. Powell, I'm not ready for the test. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm not ready for the test. I need to stay up all night. I go, no, what you need to do is go to bed around 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock at the latest. Set your alarm and get up again at 6 in the morning if you need to, because your neurons are now fresher and ready to go. You will learn much faster. So here's the caveat. I know it's late in the evening when I'm posting this, but if you really want to get the most out of this, do not do your anatomy studying after 10 o'clock at night. You want to do it in the morning when your brain is fresh, or in the afternoon. Okay. And I really think the good part is that you can break these lectures up into small parts, and so that you're not focusing on anatomy for an hour and a half at a time, that I think you can get more out of them. And with that, I am done with the entire central nervous system. So kudos for getting through it. Don't forget that there is a homework due on Wednesday, where basically you are going through all the areas of the brain, not just the cerebrum, but all the areas of the brain and what their functions are. And don't just do the frontal lobe does this. If you can get it down to a certain part of the frontal lobe, narrow it down. And so you're going to do all these, basically you're coming up with the areas of the brain and what their functions are. Make yourself a little table and then upload it before class starts on Wednesday. There's no quiz this Wednesday, I don't think, but double check the schedule, but I don't think there is one this week. All right, and with that, I shall see all of you guys on Wednesday. And thank you for all your hard work.